Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are wrestling with a fundamental tension, one that really sits right at the core of, well, human creativity and thought itself. Just, think for a moment about what you expect when you approach two very different worlds, the world of art and the world of philosophy.
It's an immediate polarization, isn't it? It's like your brain shifts gears completely.
Yeah.
When we look at a painting or listen to a piece of music, we don't just expect the creator's soul to be in there. We kind of demand it.
You demand it.
We want that personal, visceral expression. The more unique, the more idiosyncratic, the better.
That's exactly right. The artist is a success if they just lay their entire personal, emotional landscape bare for us. But then you turn the page. You go to philosophy.
A whole different ballgame.
And suddenly we expect the philosopher to be this instrument of cold, pure objectivity, rigorous thinking, total neutrality.
Any hint of personal bias, any little whiff of a subjective preference, and it's seen as a fatal flaw.
It undermines the whole thing.
The whole structure comes down. And that's where the real problem starts. If the philosopher is also human, a creature of passions and biases, just like the artist, is their personality this unavoidable contamination, something you have to fight constantly?
Or, and this is the really fascinating question, is it maybe the necessary engine, the very thing that provides the unique perspective you need for real intellectual innovation?
That's the tightrope.
That is the mission for this deep dive. We are jumping into a stack of really compelling sources that explore this philosophical bridge and also the chasm between these two worlds.
We'll be tracing the journey from, say, the emotional maximalism you find in 19th and early 20th century expressionist theories.
Like Tolstoy.
Exactly, like Tolstoy's focus on this deep emotional communication. And we're going all the way up to the radical skepticism of Friedrich Nietzsche.
The great dismantler.
The great dismantler. He was fundamentally suspicious that philosophers, far from being these objective truth seekers, were just, well, defending a fervent wish.
Just rationalizing their passions after the fact.
That's the charge. So we're going to unpack in detail how deeply these personal factors can compromise objectivity and, maybe more importantly, what philosophical inquiry and the modern academic world actually do to fight back against the self.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think we have to start where the personal element isn't just necessary, but it's the absolute foundation for value, the expressive ideal in art. So when we talk about personal expression in art, what are we really talking about?
We're talking about the reflection of the artist's entire subjective universe.
Everything.
Everything. Their emotions, their attitudes, their whole temperament, their personality, just stamped directly onto the final work.
And this wasn't always the goal, was it?
Oh, not at all. This was a revolution. The 19th century Romantic movement fundamentally elevated this subjective part of art and made it the primary goal.
It was a rebellion against classicism.
A total rebellion against that emphasis on objective beauty, on perfect form. Romanticism made the creator's inner world, their unique struggle, their personal insight, the very measure of the work's value.
And our sources highlight two really critical models for how this works. Two expressionist models.
They do. They try to define what that personal element is actually achieving.
So the first one, and probably the most famous, is the novelist and thinker Leo Tolstoy. What was his big idea about the purpose of art?
Tolstoy believed art's main goal was, and this is his term, fraternal communication.
Fraternal communication.
Fraternal communication through emotional contagion. For art to really work, for it to succeed, it has to transfer the specific emotion the artist genuinely felt during creation directly to the person experiencing it.
So it's like a direct wire.
A direct wire. The artist has to be sincere. They have to convey their feelings, joy, sorrow, anxiety, whatever it is, in the purest way possible. And if they pull it off, art unites people through that shared feeling. It transcends language, transcends culture.
It's almost an ethical view of art, then.
Very much so. It's aiming for this profound unity, even mutual love among people.
So Tolstoy's model is really beautifully straightforward. The artist feels X, they create the work, and the audience, if it's successful, genuinely feels X, communion achieved.
Precisely. But then you have the 20th century British philosopher R.G. Collingwood, who came at it from a different angle. He offered a more internal, more psychologically complex model.
Okay.
For Collingwood, art isn't about conveying an emotion that's already perfectly formed.
So the artist doesn't know what it is at the start.
Not necessarily, no. Instead, art is about clarification.
Clarification. What does that process actually look like for the artist?
Well, the artist starts with an emotion that's initially really vague. It's diffuse, maybe even murky. Just this kind of internal pressure or unrest that they can't quite put a name to. And it's through the intense active process of making the art, shaping the clay, finding the right chords, picking the words, that the artist explores, clarifies, and finally discovers the true nature of that emotion.
Ah, so it's only then that it can be appreciated.
Only then, both by the artist first and then eventually by the audience.
That is a fundamental difference. Tolstoy sees art as transmission, like sending a message.
Right.
But Collingwood sees it as self-discovery, where the creative act itself is a tool for psychological clarity.
Indeed. But, and this is what our sources really stress, despite the beauty of these models, neither of them works as a complete general theory of art.
They fall short.
They do. Expressionism is pretty easy to critique because personal expression is neither a necessary condition nor is it a sufficient condition for artistic value.
Okay, give us an example where it breaks down.
Well, it fails because an artist might produce an objectively brilliant work for purely economic reasons.
Just for the paycheck.
Exactly. Or for fame, with no sincere or deeply felt emotion required at all. And on the flip side, you could have someone agonizing deeply over a poem, really pouring their heart out, but the final product is still, aesthetically mediocre. Sincerity doesn't guarantee quality.
So, okay, even if expressionist theories aren't the whole story, that doesn't mean the personal mark on great art isn't still hugely important. We still look for the artist's signature, their unique voice.
That hunt is vital. The personal dimension is what transforms art from just being objective documentation of the world into something charged with human significance. It's the way the artist's unique point of view, the way they think and feel and experience things, filters and represents the objective world. That filtering process is what gives the artwork its specific expressive power.
And this is where we can really zoom in on an example. Let's talk about Rembrandt's painting, The Mill. What makes this painting such a powerful example of this expressive ideal?
It's a perfect case study. The expressiveness in The Mill isn't located just in the objects themselves. It's not just a picture of a mill on a hill.
It's the how.
It's in the way Rembrandt painted them. Look at the dramatic play of chromatic shadows and light. The painting creates this incredible phantasmagoria, this pervasive mood of gloomy, solitary vastness.
But the mood isn't simple, is it? It's not just gloom.
No, and that's the personal genius of it. There's this mysterious ambivalence that's built right into the composition. The sort of solitary dismay you associate with this ancient, crumbling mill is mixed with an almost serene hope.
You see it in the light breaking through.
Yes, those shafts of sunlight breaking through the heavy clouds. This unique, alluringly ambiguous mood that is the undeniable mark of the painter's specific introspective world. It's Rembrandt's own temperament projected onto the canvas.
And if we, as the viewers, feel that specific, complex, almost contradictory mood, what does a philosopher like Gerald Levinson say we're actually achieving?
Well, Levinson really zeroes in on the communicative potential of art. When we appreciate a work, especially one that expresses complex or even negative emotions, we tend to adopt what he calls the expressionist assumption.
Okay, what's that?
We imagine that the emotion expressed in the work, even if the artist wasn't feeling it at the exact moment of creation, somehow belongs to the composer's or the painter's profound interiority. We make that leap.
And what's the reward for making that imaginative leap?
He calls it the reward of intimacy.
The reward of intimacy. I like that.
By identifying with the work, the appreciator feels understood on a really deep identity-forming level, because someone else, the artist, managed to translate something that profoundly moves you into a painting or a piece of music.
So art makes the intimate communal.
It makes it shareable without ever stopping it from being deeply personal for you, the recipient. That's the synthesis.
This says a lot about how our aesthetic choices aren't trivial at all. Our sources cite Levinson making this powerful argument that your personal preferences, what art you like, what music moves you, don't just reveal who you are.
No, it's stronger than that.
They actively constitute your identity.
That's a huge claim about the role of taste. And if that's true for the person appreciating the art, just imagine how intensely true it must be for the person creating it.
Of course.
Genuine artistic creation is this highly individualized enterprise. It's driven by an almost existential need to assert your most personal values, your beliefs, your desires. Levinson sees this commitment to your own values, sometimes even heroically against tradition, as the engine for all true innovation.
So in art, that single-minded focus, that refusal to compromise your unique vision, which might look like intellectual stubbornness in philosophy, is actually a creative virtue.
Absolutely. It's the engine that powers the avant-garde. The great innovators are almost always the ones who are willing to assert their personal aesthetic values, even when faced with total indifference or hostility.
Before we move on, we should pause for a really crucial technical point: the difference between the work's expressiveness and the artist's intentions. Why is this distinction so important for getting this right?
It's crucial because if the aesthetic quality of a work depended strictly on the artist's emotional state at the moment of creation, our appreciation would be constantly undermined by biographical facts. Imagine some sad instrumental music, a beautiful, melancholic piece. The composer might have been commissioned to write a funeral piece for a huge fee, and they were personally ecstatic about it, already planning a vacation.
The music doesn't suddenly become less sad if we find that out.
Exactly. Musical or artistic expressiveness is generally seen as a quality that's in the work itself. It's apprehended directly by you, the listener, regardless of the composer's momentary mental state.
So the intention required is just the intent to make music, not the intent to feel sad while doing it.
Right. And because of that, the correct analytical path runs from the work to the artist, not the other way around.
What do you mean?
We use what philosophers call inference to the best explanation. We experience the profound depth and complexity, the melancholy vastness in Rembrandt, the sublime sadness in Bach, and then we infer that something important about the author's sensitivity, their inner world, their worldview, must have been involved to craft a work capable of generating that experience. We infer their serious commitment because that's the best explanation for the excellence of the final product.
And this leads us right to why we have such a reverence for authenticity in art. The love we feel for a work often gets projected onto its creator. The sources mention it's easier to fall in love with an artist than with a philosopher or a scientist. Why is that specific projection so strong?
Because in philosophy or science, the qualities we admire are things like rigor, logical structure, completeness. These are purely cognitive virtues. But in the great artist, we feel like we recognize a special, almost mystical sensitivity to the complexities of human drama, imaginative freedom, the ability to articulate life's nuances in a way that just escapes linear logic. The artist promises to rescue us from what Tolstoy called the suffocating sameness of everyday life.
Which explains the intense disappointment, even betrayal, we feel when we find out an artist behaved immorally or their private life seems to contradict the sensitivity in their work.
We feel betrayed because we expected the work's integrity to reflect the person's character.
Yeah.
It really speaks to the necessity of what the philosopher Peter Keavy called personal authenticity. He argued that this authenticity is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for an artist to achieve an individual, unmistakable style. To find that unique voice, the artist has to follow her star, being fundamentally true to her own unique aesthetic intuitions.
So in art, the personal dimension, the quirks, the style, the passion, that is the unique mark we value. We want the artist to be completely, unreservedly present in their creation. Their subjectivity is the source of their genius.
Yeah.
Now, we make that hard pivot. We're moving from the world where personality is cherished to the world where it's supposed to be eliminated, philosophy. Philosophy aims for pure rational scrutiny, for objectivity. But then here comes Friedrich Nietzsche, the most radical challenger of that entire idea. He just asks, is this objectivity even possible?
This is Nietzsche's radical denunciation. You find it most powerfully in Beyond Good and Evil. He completely shifts the focus away from the philosophical result and onto the philosopher's own psychological process.
He gets personal.
He gets very personal. He suggests that the entire enterprise of objective rational thought is basically built on a foundation of self-deception.
And his claim is really extreme. He argued that most of a philosopher's conscious thought, their logical steps, their definitions, their grand conclusions, is secretly being directed, maybe even forced, into certain channels by their underlying instincts and psychological needs.
Absolutely. Nietzsche sees these lofty logical systems as just elaborate masks. He says that behind all the cold, pure logic, behind the impressive dialectic and the claim of being divinely insouciant to the outcome, you find humble physiological requirements for survival, or temperament, or unacknowledged cultural values.
So they're basically just defending a fervent wish, some deep personal inspiration. The sophisticated argument we read is just rationalization after the fact.
That's the core of his critique. The impressive theoretical edifice, this massive construction of premises and theorems and definitions, is actually resting on something startlingly simple: the philosopher's basic impulses, their temperament, maybe even their diet or the climate they live in.
He was really anticipating psychoanalysis.
Decades ahead of it. He was arguing that most philosophers are just victims of their own powerful unconscious forces, which dictate the philosophical perspective even as the philosopher thinks they're being purely rational and objective.
What's fascinating is that Nietzsche suggests we should read a philosophical system as a kind of unconscious biography of its creator.
Yes.
Where their flaws and their strengths are subtly encoded in their logical structure. Do we have a strong example of him applying this kind of critique?
He certainly applied it to one of the most rigorously structured philosophical systems ever created, that of Baruch Spinoza.
Right, Spinoza, who presented his whole system in a geometrized format, like a geometry textbook.
Exactly. Ethica Ordine Geometrico Demonstrata. It was modeled after Euclidean geometry, aiming for this unquestionable certainty and total intellectual detachment.
A system that appears completely impersonal and logically cold.
And Nietzsche comes along and suggests that this very austerity, this logical perfection, can be read as a kind of psychological compensation for Spinoza's own personal flaws, or his weaknesses, or maybe the trauma he experienced being excommunicated from his community.
So the rigorous structure is born from a personal need for control.
A psychological defense mechanism, rather than just the inevitable result of dispassionate inquiry.
That is a brutal diagnosis, because it immediately asks us to treat every single philosophical work, no matter how objective it seems, as this intensely personal reflection of its author's unacknowledged baggage.
And that, of course, leads us to the classic metacritique dilemma.
Right. If all philosophy is just rationalization, then isn't Nietzsche's own argument just a rationalization of his passionate will to power?
Doesn't his argument just collapse under its own weight? If he denies objective truth, how can his claim about the subjectivity of philosophers be objectively true?
It's a classic trap.
It is, and this challenge is why the interpretation offered by scholars like Gareth Southwell is so vital for making Nietzsche's critique, actionable. Southwell suggests that Nietzsche's main criticism isn't that philosophers are influenced by instinct.
He accepts that as a given.
He accepts it as unavoidable because, in his view, the search for purely objective truth is an illusion anyway.
So what's the real sin then?
The real sin is insincerity. It's unconscious hypocrisy. Philosophers pretend they are these neutral, transparent minds, when in fact they are profoundly moved by their gut, by their biases, by their personal needs.
So Nietzsche's goal isn't to get to objective truth.
No, it's to encourage philosophers to be honest about their passions and to consciously incorporate the instincts that serve what he calls the affirmation of life.
So the ultimate goal becomes a kind of subjective sincerity and transparent advocacy, not impersonal neutrality.
And what's crucial for our deep dive today is this. Even if you set aside Nietzsche's most extreme perspectivism, his outright denial of objective truth, the core idea remains not just uncontroversial, but profoundly relevant to modern epistemology.
Which is?
That the objectivity of philosophical inquiry is severely, systematically threatened by the philosopher's personality, their biases, and crucially, their motivated rationality. Nietzsche was anticipating the entire modern field of cognitive biases and experimental psychology on human reasoning.
So the philosopher, just like the artist, carries their entire biographical baggage with them. The difference is the job requirement.
Exactly. The artist has to embrace it. The philosopher is institutionally obligated to deny it.
Okay, let's get into the weeds on this. If the philosopher's sensibility and personality are always interfering, how specifically does this actually show up in the intellectual process?
Yeah.
Our sources lay out 3 critical pathways where personal factors can subtly compromise that search for truth.
Right. The first pathway has to do with the very structure of knowledge itself. We can call it 1, the problem of basic beliefs.
Basic beliefs.
Every philosophical system, every serious argument has to start somewhere. You can't have an infinite regress where you have to justify every single premise forever. You have to assume certain ideas just to get the argumentative machinery running.
And the moment you choose where to start, you've introduced subjectivity.
That's it, precisely. The decision of when and where and how the argumentation begins or ends, what we call the foundational framework, is inherently a personal one. It's guided heavily by the philosopher's sensibility, their taste, their entire lived experience.
These are the basic beliefs, the ones accepted without being inferred from other beliefs.
Yes. And the challenge then is how do you legitimize those foundational assumptions without just being arbitrary?
Historically, there was a very high bar for this, right?
Classical foundationalism had an almost impossibly rigorous standard. A belief was considered properly basic only if it was either self-evident, like a logical axiom A is A, or if it was incorrigible.
Incorrigible meaning it couldn't be rationally doubted.
Right, like a basic sensory experience, I am seeing red, or Descartes' famous, I think, therefore I am.
That standard sounds almost impossible to meet for any really substantive philosophical claim about, say, morality or metaphysics. It really narrows the field.
It does, and this is where a philosopher like Alvin Plantinga comes into the debate, mostly in the philosophy of religion. He critiqued this classical foundationalism as being self-referentially incoherent.
How so?
He pointed out that the very principle of foundationalism, the idea that all beliefs have to be self-evident or incorrigible, is itself neither self-evident nor incorrigible, nor can it be logically derived from such beliefs. It's a rule that breaks its own rule.
Ah, okay. So Plantinga proposed a different, less strict measure for what counts as a basic belief.
He proposed what he called explanatory circumstances. A belief is justified as basic for a person if that person is in a certain condition or circumstance. The circumstances are what do the legitimizing.
Can you give an example?
Sure. If you look ahead in broad daylight and you believe you see a tree, that belief is appropriate. Not because it's absolutely incorrigible, you could be hallucinating, but because the circumstances, your normal vision, the environment, all legitimize it as a starting point for thought and action.
That makes a lot of sense for everyday life.
Yeah.
But how does this idea of justification by circumstance hold up under the really intense epistemic obligations of philosophy, especially with Nietzsche's skepticism in the background?
And that's where our sources find Plantinga's framework to be, well, inadequate for high-level philosophical rigor.
Why?
While his theory might say mitigate personal responsibility in common life, like if someone grows up in an isolated obscurantist community, their belief in astrology might be understandable given their circumstances. It can't justify the foundational beliefs a philosopher adopts when they're aiming for a solid, universally defensible theory.
Because if circumstances legitimize the belief, then a philosopher raised in a certain tradition could have their basic beliefs legitimized just because that's their circumstance, which sounds like it opens the door to total relativism.
It's a huge risk. Plantinga's justification by circumstance could end up legitimizing beliefs that are merely arbitrary or culturally contingent rather than rationally defensible. Philosophical inquiry can't just rest its foundations on mitigating personal responsibility.
So what's the alternative?
Well, this is why a coherentist approach is generally preferred in philosophy, one that focuses not on these isolated foundational beliefs, but on how a vast network of ideas supports and interlocks with one another, checking and balancing for internal consistency.
But even with that model, the personality of the researcher still chooses that initial framework. What's the key to mitigating that personal preference?
The crucial requirement is that the basic beliefs or intuitions tied to the philosopher's emotionality or temperament can only be appropriate if they are open to permanent criticism. They have to be a malleable starting point, not an indubitable, unshakable assumption.
And that leads us right to the second pathway for bias.
Directly. Which involves the motivational structure of the research itself.
Right. 2, research motivations and the rationalization trap. We assume passion for a topic is a good thing, right? It drives you.
It is initially a huge advantage. Personal interest, passion, that leads a researcher to read more widely, to diversify their sources, to refine their arguments tirelessly, to explore unusual paths. It's the fuel for deep research.
So where does that virtue curdle into a fatal flaw?
The danger arises when the passion for the topic, say, the philosophy of mind, unconsciously shifts into a motivation to defend a given thesis within that topic, no matter what the evidence says.
For example?
A philosopher might be deeply passionate about consciousness, and that passion subtly becomes a tenacious need to defend the thesis of, say, substance dualism, because it satisfies a personal, emotional, or religious need.
This is exactly what Nietzsche was warning about. The superstitious tendency to believe that if you believe something really firmly, that makes it more likely to be true.
The rationalization trap.
So let's define rationalization precisely here to distinguish it from something legitimate, like hypothesis testing.
Okay. In an honest investigation, the justification precedes the answer. You neutrally look for evidence, and you let the weight of logic and facts lead you to the most plausible conclusion, even if it's one you don't like.
And rationalization is the reverse.
It's the complete reverse. In rationalization, the answer is accepted at the outset, usually because it aligns with some deep personal desire or conviction. all the subsequent logical effort is just spent fabricating justifications after the fact to defend that predetermined answer.
So you're not seeking truth. You're seeking ammunition.
You're defending a verdict you decided on before the trial even began.
And this brings us to the third and, frankly, most chilling pathway for bias.
3. Unconscious intentions and cognitive biases. Nietzsche saw the unconscious drives, but modern experimental psychology provides the receipts.
Let's talk about David Robson's work on the intelligence trap. We have this ingrained belief in society that higher analytical intelligence automatically leads to better rational thought, but the research suggests maybe the opposite.
It's a deeply disturbing finding. Studies consistently show that high analytical intelligence can actually be a threat to good thought performance.
A threat?
Yes, precisely because intelligent people are more prone to certain biases, and the chief among them is rationalization.
How does being smarter make you worse at avoiding irrationality? That feels so counterintuitive.
Because high intelligence gives you superior ammunition for self-deception. When an intelligent person makes an intuitive error, a quick, what we call a System 1 jump, they have a greater capacity to use their sophisticated reasoning ability, their System 2, to construct these elaborate, intellectually robust arguments to justify their mistake instead of correcting it.
They build a formidable logical fortress around a faulty premise.
They're too good at arguing themselves out of being wrong, and that leads to intellectual rigidity.
So it makes them more dogmatic.
Exactly. More dogmatic, less likely to learn from criticism, and critically lacking in intellectual humility. The philosopher can spend decades developing an exquisitely detailed system that, when you really look at it, is just rationalizing an arbitrary basic belief they picked 20 years ago.
Let's make this really concrete with a philosophical hypothetical.
Yeah.
How would this intelligence trap actually manifest in, say, a metaphysician?
Okay. Imagine a philosopher who is deeply personally committed to a particular version of philosophical idealism, the idea that reality is fundamentally mental or conscious. And this belief satisfies a deep-seated personal need for meaning or order. Maybe it stems from a fear of a cold, random cosmos. Now they are confronted with powerful empirical evidence or a strong logical counterexample that argues for materialism. A less intelligent person might just shrug and say, okay, I guess I was wrong.
But the highly intelligent philosopher does not.
No. They use their vast knowledge of logic, of language, of the history of philosophy to perform these incredible intellectual gymnastics. They might redefine key terms like matter or experience. They'll introduce highly nuanced qualifications to their premises or deploy complex semantic arguments to show why the counterexample is actually just a semantic illusion.
They're using their analytical engine not to find the truth, but to protect the initial bias.
They're using their System 2 to serve the bias jump made by their System 1, and in doing so, they become even more entrenched in the error.
This is why that distinction from Daniel Kahneman between System 1 and System 2 is so vital here. Philosophy is supposed to be the definitive domain of System 2 thinking.
It's all about slow, deliberate, conscious thought aimed at escaping the quick, intuitive biases of System 1. That's the ideal.
And academic philosophy, that happens under conditions with time for reflection, peer dialogue, that should minimize these traps.
It should, but the findings by philosophers and psychologists like Eric Schwiskeball and Joshua Cushman suggest that that training is far from an inoculation.
We're talking about their article, which had the brutal title, Philosophers' Biased Judgments Persist Despite Training, Expertise, and Reflection. What did they find when they actually studied highly educated philosophers?
They found that even these experts, people highly trained in logic, formal reasoning, and critical thinking, are still demonstrably vulnerable to classic cognitive biases.
Like what?
Particularly framing and ordering effects. These are biases where your moral or critical judgment changes based on totally irrelevant aspects of the situation, like the order in which options are presented to you.
And the most sobering, almost depressing finding was the failure of reflection itself.
Absolutely. The researchers forced these highly educated philosophers into deliberate System 2 reflection. They explicitly told them to delay their judgment, encourage them to consider alternatives, look for flaws in their initial gut feeling.
Yeah.
The biases persisted. Their extensive training and expertise did not inoculate them against the fundamental vulnerabilities of human cognition.
So the intelligence trap plus the persistence of unconscious biases. It tells us that the ideal of the purely objective, detached philosopher isn't just rare, it might be physiologically impossible.
The objectivity of philosophical inquiry is severely systematically threatened by the very architecture of the human mind.
So if the philosopher is their own worst enemy, brilliantly capable of rationalizing their own flaws and just perpetually vulnerable to unconscious bias, what are the antidotes? How does philosophy fight back against the inescapable subjectivity of the individual?
The sources really converge on a two-pronged solution. First, you have the cultivation of specific intellectual virtues. And second, and maybe more powerfully, you have a shift toward a communal epistemology. We just can't trust the isolated mind.
Okay, let's start with virtue. What personal dispositions can someone actually cultivate to counteract these systemic vulnerabilities?
Well, there are concrete reasons for hope here, based on psychological research. Studies show that cognitive performance, the ability to think well and avoid biases, can be significantly improved by cultivating what we call intellectual virtues.
Such as?
Things like metacognitive reflection, which is the ability to constantly question and scrutinize your own assumptions. Intellectual humility, which is just recognizing the limits of your own knowledge. Open-mindedness. And intellectual courage, the willingness to abandon cherished ideas when the evidence tells you to.
This suggests that education, intellectual education, shouldn't just be about teaching students what to think, but teaching them how to approach the very act of knowing.
Exactly. Our sources mention models like the Academy of Intellectual Virtues, which explicitly complements traditional academic teaching with active reflection and the practical cultivation of these epistemic virtues. The underlying problem isn't just a lack of information, it's a deficit of intellectual character that allows bias to just flourish unchecked.
But we have to confront the Nietzschean dilemma here. If these biases are unconscious and they operate below our level of awareness, how much can individual intellectual humility really achieve, no matter how sincere the philosopher tries to be?
And that's the critical limitation of individual virtue. It's why the second antidote is so essential, the coherentist social solution. What ultimately legitimizes our basic beliefs and mitigates our deeply embedded biases is networked knowledge.
Networked knowledge.
Fostered by socially oriented epistemologies.
Okay, explain what that looks like in the academic world.
It's the realization that knowledge is legitimized only when it circulates freely in a broad adversarial academic debate, where the permanent institutionalized will to refute ideas is actively encouraged.
So it's a battle royale of ideas.
You could see it that way. Jonathan Rauch argues that creating institutions like universities and academic journals that are capable of regulating this contestation of ideas is one of the greatest advances of modern society.
So truth isn't something the lone genius discovers by staring into their soul.
No, it's something the community validates by persistently, relentlessly trying to tear it down and failing to do so.
That's the engine of peer review.
That's the whole idea. And epistemologists like John Hardwig and Giorno Ritter argue that we have to abandon this traditional individualistic perspective. The reality is our mutual epistemic dependence on each other is now so total that knowledge should be seen as belonging irreducibly to the community of researchers, not to any single individual who happens to write the final paper.
This sounds perfectly aligned with how modern science operates, where you have extended co-authorship as the standard.
And here we had a structural dilemma that makes the philosopher's struggle unique.
How so?
In science, a paper might have dozens, even hundreds of authors, which dilutes individual responsibility for any single error. But in philosophy, articles with co-authors are the exception, and they usually only have 2 or 3. Books are almost always solo efforts.
Why this structural solitude in philosophy?
Philosophical thought, especially in areas like metaphysics or epistemology, requires a permanent unitary understanding of the argument step by step from premise to conclusion. It's incredibly difficult to delegate parts of the argumentative path without compromising the coherence of the entire system.
So each philosophical work is still a genuine instance of intense personal expression.
The expression of the author's own beliefs, clearly identified, where all the praise and all the criticism will be directed at that one individual alone. The philosopher maintains a much higher level of authorial commitment than the scientist. They can't easily dilute their personal biases across 50 names on a title page.
Which is why the institutional imperative of mutual scrutiny becomes the philosopher's ethical and epistemic anchor.
It has to be. The philosopher has to replace that romantic image of Descartes alone by the fireplace, seeking clear and distinct ideas in solitude, with an image that emphasizes radical transparency and critical collaboration.
And the mechanism to enforce that is the peer review process.
Peer review is the ultimate institutional antidote to personal bias. It forces the author's ideas to be scrutinized externally. It compels the philosopher to go outside their own head and subject their personalized intuitive basis to the intellectual rigor of the community. Ideally, the intensely personal character of a basic belief or a rationalized conviction disappears until its validity acquires a kind of universality within the research community, supported by rational warrants rather than just individual passion.
So, while the philosophical process starts as this highly personalized journey driven by passion and basic beliefs, just like art, the institutional machinery immediately starts working to purge that personal signature, all in the name of objective, universal truth. And we've arrived back where we started, but now with a much deeper understanding of these inherent personal tensions in both disciplines. So let's formally draw the line. What are the distinct aspirations of art and philosophy?
The Great Divide really rests on the treatment of the subjective self. In philosophy, the personal component is the element you intend to eliminate.
Or at least transcend.
Or transcend, yes, in the pursuit of rigor, universality, and objectivity. If a philosopher says they are merely being faithful to oneself, it's often read as a sign of obtuse and inflexible pride, a failure to submit to the demands of impersonal reason.
Whereas in art, the personal element is sought out. It's elaborated on, transfigured into an object worthy of appreciation. Fidelity to oneself isn't a flaw there.
No, it's a condition for originality, for style, for the very source of emotional connection.
And think about the role of reason in both.
It's completely different. If a philosopher starts with a strong intuition, they have to subject it to this fierce rational criticism until it becomes a rationally grounded element, something capable of universal defense.
But the artist?
The artist uses reason at the service of their creative fantasy, not to constrain it. The goal is expression, not demonstrable truth. As the aesthetician Edward Hanslick argued, you can't compose great music by just mathematically calculating sound ratios. The beauty requires an intuitive, subjective leap.
Despite this foundational split, the issue gets complicated because art doesn't want to be merely personal. It aspires to address something true and universal.
Yes.
Both art and philosophy share the decisive themes of the human condition: love, mortality, justice, freedom, the meaning of existence.
They absolutely share the subject matter, and the great difference is in the synthesis. How does art manage to achieve the universal while remaining so intensely subjective and personal?
It achieves what Levinson called that unique synthesis. It makes the intimate communal and shareable without ceasing to be intimate.
It connects the unique, singular, personal experience of the creator to the universal, human, emotional experience.
And this brings us back to Tolstoy's electric spark analogy. But maybe we can understand it now in the context of alienation. When people feel separated or alone in their experiences, a story, a performance, a painting, or most frequently music, will unite them all with an electric spark. Each person rejoices not because they feel the exact same emotion the artist felt, but because they realize another human being felt deeply enough or observed keenly enough to articulate that complex feeling for them.
Establishing a communion that rescues us from that alienation and the suffocating sameness of everyday life. It's a profound social and emotional goal, but it relies on completely different evaluation criteria than philosophy. The final measure of value differs sharply. A philosophical theory is judged by whether it is logically coherent, internally consistent, well-grounded, explanatory, and stubbornly resistant to counterexamples. We demand intellectual rigor.
We expect a philosophical argument to stand up to intellectual assault in a court of pure reason.
But art is judged by emotional significance, intensity, aesthetic complexity, coherence of form. We expect it to sweep us away, to fill us with awe, or provide catharsis. If art aspires to some kind of truth, it achieves it in a way philosophy can't accommodate, what we call non-propositional truth.
This concept of non-propositional truth is the crux of the final division, and it needs to be unpacked. Philosophical truth, by its very nature, has to be translated into linguistically articulable propositions.
Arguments, claims, syllogisms, logical statements, it has to be broken down and analyzed.
But art's unique profundity often resists that linguistic breakdown. The truth it conveys about tragedy or love or the sublime, it just surpasses all the paraphrases that philosophy can offer.
Think about a profound piece of literature, like Shakespeare's King Lear. That play conveys these profound, inarticulable truths about power, aging, filial cruelty. We feel it to be true, universally true, about the human condition.
But if a philosopher tried to distill those insights into a set of logical propositions, like Proposition A, power corrupts absolutely, Proposition B, old age diminishes judgment, the resulting philosophical statement would be so thin.
Obvious, even. And it would completely fail to capture the profound, irreducible knowledge that's contained in the play itself.
That's the inadequacy of logic in the face of aesthetic knowledge.
The knowledge art gives us about a subject just can't be fully captured by linguistic claims or reduced to a set of premises. And this leads us right back to Immanuel Kant's concept of aesthetic ideals.
Okay, what are aesthetic ideas in this context?
Kant described them as representations of the imagination that occasions much thinking without any determinate concept ever being fully adequate to it.
So the art gives us a glimpse of an infinite realm of thought.
But any attempt to articulate that thought fully, logically, just results in conceptual inadequacy. Art communicates a truth that is whole, immediate, and resistant to linear articulation.
It's a knowledge that deeply informs our understanding of existence, conveyed in a way that defies the demands of System 2 thinking, yet it still registers as deeply true.
Indeed, it demonstrates that the expressive path of art isn't just an emotional luxury. It's a genuine epistemic path to understanding existence, a path that logic, by its necessary focus on propositions and analysis, is simply inadequate to traverse on its own.
And that brings us to the end of our exploration. We started by affirming the necessity of expression in art, we traced the inevitability of personality in philosophy, and then we examined the arduous, institutional, and virtuous means philosophers have to employ to fight their own subjectivity.
The whole exercise reveals this fascinating human paradox. Both disciplines start with a personal impulse, and both aspire to reveal something universal. Yet one seeks to filter the personal out through cold, rigorous logic.
And the other seeks to synthesize the intensely personal into a shareable object of aesthetic experience. So, what does this all mean for you? If philosophy strives for objective truth through rigorous articulation and logic, demanding we escape our biases, and art gives us this profound shared insight into existence without using propositions,
then what does this profound divergence tell us about the nature of truth itself? Is there a profound knowledge about the human condition, about love, death, and justice, that only the expressive, non-propositional path of art can fully convey? Is logic, by its very nature, inadequate to grasp the most profound truths of our shared existence? That is a question worth exploring and struggling with long after this deep dive is complete.